This is general feedback for the Euthyphro mini essay assignment 4M, and there will be 2 videos. I'm breaking it into parts. In the first part, we'll talk about writing generally. The feedback here should apply to any essay you'll write for this course. In this video, we're talking about the Euthyphro problem. If you're going to write clearly about a topic, it helps to deeply understand that topic. So let's begin by going through the Euthyphro Dialogue with an emphasis on the Euthyphro problem, since that's what most people wrote about. In the reading guide, I referred to a specific part of the Euthyphro Dialogue as the Euthyphro Problem. If you were to Google this, you might have found material that isn't quite what we're focusing on. So we're focusing on the actual dialogue, the question that comes up in the dialogue, and how Socrates and Euthyphro reason through that question. That question has been taken up in a modern context, in the context of reasoning about divine command theory, and it looks a little different in that context. In quite a few papers, it felt to me like people had Googled Euthyphro or the Euthyphro problem and were writing about a slightly different version of the problem that doesn't deeply engage with the text. So 2 points there. 1, be careful when Googling to make sure you are finding the right topic. And 2, be sure to include links to your sources, what you're drawing upon. So it's not a problem that you did look into this, even though I suggested in the prompt that it would be better if you didn't try to look for more sources to help you understand, but just do your best with the text. But if you felt like you really needed to look into this more, you just weren't getting it, that's fine, but you should include your sources in this context. That was part of the prompt, asking you to do that, and I could tell that a lot of people were feeling stuck in Googling and finding a source that wasn't quite what we were working with. So cite your sources. Okay, so what is the Euthyphro problem as referred to in the reading guide? And that is the basis for the sources that you might have found if you Googled it. The Euthyphro problem, or sometimes called the Euthyphro question, is something that most people writing about this topic did identify clearly. And the question has to do with the relationship between being pious and being God-loved. So take, for example, prayer. This is a simple example of something that is supposed to be pious and presumably something that God loves. The question is, yes, it has both of these properties. This is pious and it's God-loved. But is it God-loved because it's pious, or is it pious just because God loves it? That's what makes it pious. So that's the central question. But what's the problem? Or sometimes this is called the Euthyphro dilemma. What's the dilemma? In order to really get at what the problem here is supposed to be, it would help to, as clearly as possible, explain, where does this question come from? How do we end up with this question in the first place? So let's zoom out into the dialogue just enough to make it super clear how we even end up asking this question so that we can understand what the problem is supposed to be. So let's, just for how we talk about this, let's let X be an example of piety. So we already pointed out prayer, but maybe like providing hospitality to strangers. That's something that Zeus loves, if you remember Xenia. Sacrifice, attending festivals, prosecuting the wrongdoer is an example that Euthyphro gives. So let X be an example of piety. And this dialogue is centrally about the question is, what is piety? What does it mean to say that X is pious? And Euthyphro provides a couple of answers along the way to this question. Which answer has he provided such that we end up eventually with this Euthyphro question, the question we just discussed? That definition is that pious is what is dear to the gods. So this is his first good answer. That isn't an example. This comes before we get to the Euthyphro problem. It's relevant to where the Euthyphro problem or question comes from, but we're still not to that question yet. So let's go through the steps that lead us to that question. And along the way, I want to clarify a couple of things. So 2 things that I want to hit on are the question of how do we know, as well as the question of disagreement amongst the gods. So importantly, we want to make sure we have the actual Euthyphro problem and relevant argument down before we evaluate it, say what the problem with it is, whether we're talking about our own views about what the problem is or what Socrates thinks the problem is when we're summarizing. But I do want to focus on 2 questions that come up when people were writing about the Euthyphro problem that are somewhat beside the point. And I want to just identify them right off the bat. And one question is this: how do we know that there are any gods? That doesn't come up in the dialogue at all. But you might be wondering, insofar as piety is defined in terms of what's dear to the gods, how do we know there are gods? And even if we're right that there are, how do we know what they want from us? What do they love? What's dear to the gods? How does anyone know that? Now this is clearly a relevant question, but importantly, it's not a question that's on the table at this point in the discussion between Socrates and Euthyphro. At around 6b in the text, we do get some discussion of what we know, and Euthyphro here is claiming that he knows what the gods love, and here's a little quote yes, Socrates, and so are even more surprising things of which the majority has no knowledge, if you remember that bit of the text. So there is some discussion of what we know, but Euthyphro is claiming to know, and we're sort of accepting that for the sake of argument. Now, if you ended up discussing how we know at some point in your evaluation, that could be, a relevant point to bring up. But insofar as we're just trying to summarize what the Euthyphro problem is, how this question arises, and what the so what is, this question of how do we know was technically not relevant to this summary because they have agreed that they know. And the point of this Euthyphro problem, when we finally get to it, is that there is a problem even if we assume that we know that there are gods and what exactly they want from us. If we know which things are pious, beyond a doubt, there is still a problem with that definition of pious. We'll get to that. Okay, the other thing that a lot of people wrote about was disagreement. But this comes up before we get to the actual the Euthyphro question. So let's go through that super quickly, but that's also not relevant to the bit you were actually asked to focus on. So Euthyphro's first definition here, what is dear to the gods, it leads to Socrates' first objection to it. And it's worth saying something about it to get at why we're not focusing on knowledge here. So the problem with defining pious in terms of what is dear to the gods is that gods here is plural, and if the common beliefs about the gods are correct, they disagree about a lot of stuff, and Socrates, leads Euthyphro down a line of questions where he agrees that, yeah, it's likely they're going to disagree about some of the relevant things here too. And if it turns out that Zeus loves X, say hospitality, and let's say that Athena hates hospitality, well, then X is dear to one god, but not dear to another god. And pious, whatever the relationship between piety and being loved by the gods is, it holds in the case of Zeus, it doesn't hold in the case of Athena, so we get a contradiction. It looks like X is both pious and not pious at the same time. And importantly, the question of, well, how do we know who Zeus is, or how do we know who Athena is, or how do we know what they both like, doesn't matter, insofar as it's possible that there will be at least one case where gods disagree about something that will undermine our definition. So we can assume complete knowledge and there's still a problem here because of the definition. But we can fix that. Pious is what's dear to all the gods. That helps. Now we can't get gods disagreeing about anything. So anything that all the gods agree on, that will be pious. And if you happen to believe in only one god, that also solves the problem. So how does this revised definition fare? And keep in mind our assumptions. Assuming there are gods, we know what they love and want from us, and they don't disagree. The pious is what is dear to all the gods. So now that we have the pesky disagreement consideration resolved, we can focus in on the question, right? So in explaining the question, it'll be important to emphasize that the definition Euthyphro has provided us, what is dear to all the gods, that's what's pious. We might be interested in what exactly the nature of the relationship between these things is. So take our previous example, prayer. This is something that, and let's say every other pious thing as well is on the list. These are all things that are pious: prayer, hospitality, worship, sacrifice, whatever. These are all things that are pious, and also they are all things that gods love. So even if we don't go any further in our investigations, so long as we know what the gods love and want from us, we know what's on the list, we'll get it right. We'll do the pious thing. We can get it right. But that's not enough for Socrates. Just knowing which things are pious, which things the gods love. That's not what he's asking for. We've got a list of things we can do, but what we don't have yet is, what does it mean to be pious? Why are these things on the list? Euthyphro's definition so far tells us what has to be on the list. Anything that's on the list is going to be both pious and loved by the gods. And so long as we have the list, we'll do pretty well when it comes to deciding how to act. But when it comes to knowing what is piety, why are these things on the list, we haven't answered that question. And that's the question that Socrates wants an answer to throughout the dialogue. So, if we want that answer, this definition that Euthyphro has given us is ambiguous, because these things could be on the list because of their piety, and that is why the gods love the things on this list, because they're all pious things, or they could be on the list merely because they are, because the gods love them. So they're pious just because the gods happen to love these things. The fact that this is the question we want to answer and the potential answer is ambiguous leads us to the question: is the pious being loved by the gods because it is pious, or is the pious because it is being loved by the gods? The question is, which one of these options is the right answer? The problem or dilemma is that both answers have problems. Now, if you Googled this, you probably found the modern Euthyphro problem in the context of talking about divine command theory, and the problem with each option is put this way. Option 1, pious because loved, seems arbitrary. What explains why prayer or sacrifice or hospitality or whatever is loved, and what explains why murder is hated. It seems like if what's pious is a matter of it's what it is because God loves it. So the modern Euthyphro Problem just talks about God and his commands. So if you ought to not murder because God commands, thou shalt not murder, what makes it wrong to murder is God's commands, that he does not love murder. If he did love murder, then you ought to murder, if he loved and commanded it. That seems like a problem. The other option, that the pious thing is loved for its piety, because it's pious, well, if this answer is right, we haven't answered the question. What's that? And now if you think that we must believe in God and figure out what he has commanded in order to live a moral life because morality depends on God's commands, if it turns out you go with option 2, it looks like God commands what he does for a reason, and maybe that reason, since it's independent of God, like it exists independently of God, then maybe we can come to know about it independently of our belief in God. So it seems like if you believe in God, where the question of how do you know is relevant here. Assuming you know there is a God and assuming you know what he has or has not commanded, there is a problem. What does it mean when you talk about the relationship between morality and his commands? In one case, it seems like his commands are arbitrary, and that sounds not good. We praise him for his beneficence, but that would be vacuous. All that it means is that he commands what he does. And if you go with the other option for spelling out the relationship between God's and his commands, it looks like there's some independent reason for him commanding what he does, and we might be interested in what those reasons are. Okay. That's the modern problem. But it doesn't quite look like that in the text. So if you're saying you saw that discussion in the text, you weren't reading the text. You were reading whatever you Googled. That being said, if you did try your best to stick to the text is tricky. I totally understand that. So let's go through the actual problem here in the text at a somewhat general level. We're not going to get too much into the details of the argument. We're not going to spell them out in standard form, but we'll at least get the big picture sense of how Socrates raises this problem and then uses it as a problem for Euthyphro's answer, which is that what's pious is what is loved by all the gods. So let's start with where Euthyphro says, I don't know what you mean, Socrates. The question has just been raised in 10a, thereabouts, and Euthyphro says, I don't know what you mean, Socrates. Well, and then it's followed by this carried seen and loved bit, and what I want to say is that when Euthyphro says, I don't know what you mean, and then Socrates starts talking about this, he's trying to explain the meaning of because that he has in mind. So again, say we know what's on the list. All this stuff is pious. All this stuff is loved by the gods. But is it God loved because it's pious? Option 1 here. Or is it pious because it's God loved? Option 2. What do you mean by because here? So there might be lots of relationships between things that share two properties. So is this a square because it has 4 sides? That's one thing we might mean if we ask, like, why is this a square? Because it has 4 sides. Or is it because I moved my pencil around in a particular motion and this is what happened? That's why it's a square. I moved my pencil around. These are different kinds of because relationships. And what we're asking for is, what's the relationship between pious and God-loved, such that all the things on this list have both properties? Or let's look at another list where everything on the list has 2 properties. So I put cats, pigs, humans, dogs, whatever on this list. All of the things on this list have a heart, and they also all have lungs. So everything on this list has 2 properties. And by parity, to make this structurally similar to the question at hand, we might say, look, everything on this list has a heart, and everything on this list has lungs. There are things with a heart, things with lungs. Do they have lungs because they have a heart, or do they have a heart because they have lungs? And you might say, that's the wrong relationship here. It's neither. Neither of those two options are correct. Why? Because of the kind of thing we're talking about. There's perhaps some other reason why things have both hearts and lungs. So we're not even in the right realm trying to flesh out this relationship. So it depends. What is the relationship that's appropriate here? Now the question seems to make sense in this case. This is not like, you might think, the case of hearts and lungs. I mean, if you did, you could try to argue why it's neither option. There's some third option, a common thing in virtue of which prayer is both pious and God-loved. It's some third thing. But insofar as that seems to initially not make sense, what we're interested in is the relationship. So we are being asked to think deeply about how these two things are related. That's the point. Okay, so we want to clarify, what do you mean because? And Socrates starts talking about carrying and seeing and loving and whatnot. This is his first attempt to clarify what we mean by because. So take as an example this kitten. Is this kitten a carried thing? Not unless you pick it up and carry it. You act on the thing and thereby change it. So the relationship between you carrying the kitten and the kitten being a carried thing. So we could say of the kitten that it's a carried thing and it's being carried. So it's being carried and it's a carried thing. It has both of these properties. But why does it have both of these properties? The fundamental one is that it's being carried. Because it's being carried, it is a carried thing. It is not the other option. It's a carried thing because it's being carried. Okay, so in the carrying case, there's only one direction. It's a carried thing because it's being carried. Is the relationship between piety and being loved by the gods like this? Well, let's talk about loved, the relationship of being a loved thing. Okay, let's skip all the other examples and go straight from carried to loved, specifically being God-loved, okay? So let's say that petting kittens is a God-loved thing. This is a thing that gods love, okay? So what is the relationship here? Petting kittens has both of the following properties. It's a God-loved thing, and it's a thing that's being loved by the gods. So what is the order of the relationship here? Is this a God-loved thing? Because gods love it. It's being loved by the gods, like being carried. This is a thing gods love, and that is why it's a God-loved thing? Or is it a God-loved thing first, and that's why gods love it? The latter one doesn't make any sense. This is like the carried relationship. It's a God-loved thing only if, in fact, the gods love it. Gods are loving this thing. Now, is that what because is supposed to mean in the case of the relationship between piety and being loved by the gods? If we just mean this is the correct relationship for what being loved by gods confers on a thing. The mere fact that a thing is loved by gods makes it a God-loved thing. In the same way that being carried makes whatever's being carried a carried thing. So is that the appropriate relationship between piety and being loved by the gods? Does being loved by the gods make a thing God-loved? Clearly, yes. That is the correct conceptual, or whatever, maybe we're not talking causal, we might not be talking conceptual, but that is the appropriate relationship, seemingly conceptual, between what the result of being loved by the gods is. So if a thing is being loved by the gods, like petting kittens, that makes it a God-loved thing. That's pretty clear. But does that make it a pious thing? That's less clear. One of these things is, of course it does. The other is, how would that work? And so when Socrates goes on to ask Euthyphro, why do the gods love the pious thing? The stuff on the list: prayer, sacrifice, hospitality, worship. Why do gods love this thing? Because it's pious, or for some other reason? And Euthyphro goes with, clearly because it's pious. Okay, so quick recap here. Being loved by the gods is why anything is God-loved. This is essentially the point of the whole carried section. That's true. Like, being loved by gods, that makes anything God-loved. And let's say, for example, prayer is being loved by the gods. And so for that reason, it's obviously God-loved. But then, why do gods love prayer? That's still a question we have. Is it because it's pious, or for some other reason, or maybe no reason at all? This isn't in the text. Socrates just says, or for some other reason. And Euthyphro immediately says, well, yeah, because it's pious. Which is the undoing of his answer. Okay, so why is this the undoing of Euthyphro's proposed answer, which is what? What was the proposed answer? It's that piety is what is dear to the gods, what the gods. Remember, everything on our list is both pious and God-loved, and Euthyphro has proposed, yeah, because being God-loved, that's what it means to be pious, and Socrates has pointed out they could be related in two different ways. Euthyphro has agreed now to two propositions, to two claims. One is that the pious is God-loved because gods love it, because that's how things get to be God-loved. That's just like a conceptual claim. And the next is that gods love the pious because it's pious, which he's just agreed to, which he could have said, no, gods just love the pious because they do, and that's what makes it pious, and he could keep his answer. So there's this open road that he doesn't take, but he does agree that it's pious. And to many people that seems plausible, that they like the pious actions for a reason, for their piety, whatever that is. And then there's this complicated exchange here. So Euthyphro's agreed to these two problems, or to these two claims, and don't really, worry about this little step too much. I'm going to just big picture it in a moment. But if these two were the same, they should be interchangeable, you might think. Anywhere in this sentence here where there's the word pious, we should be able to put in God-loved. And anywhere we have God-loved in a sentence, we should be able to substitute pious. So if we did that here, say, we would get pious things are pious, or I forget, it gets complicated. Okay, so let's say we take this instance of God-loved here and we substitute the word pious. That gives us the pious as pious because the gods love it. Well, this conflicts with what he just said. So that's a problem. Or if we were to take in this next sentence here the word pious and replace it with God-loved, because they're supposed to be the same thing, we end up with the claim that gods love God-loved things because they're God-loved things. But this seems to conflict with the other thing we agreed to, the order of the because here, the nature of the because relationship here. So if these things are the same, then the two things we agreed to don't make sense. So the question still is, how exactly are these things related? They don't seem to be the same thing. Now, you might challenge whether or not it's okay to, just because they are defined in terms of one another, to just use them interchangeably. We're not going to get into that here. Let's just go to the big takeaway point. The claim is that it can't be that the pious is the same thing as the God-loved, because the pious is loved because it's fit to be loved. It's loved for a reason, whereas God-loved merely means, in fact, loved by the gods. And this leaves open space between the two concepts, whether or not anything inhabits that space or not. So here's what it might look like in a picture. So take all the things that God loves. Here's a subset of those things, all the pious things. Gods love all these things. These are the pious things that gods love. They also love some extra stuff. Maybe gods love kittens and triangles and chaos and circus peanuts, whatever else they might love. Maybe there's nothing in here. Maybe everything they love is pious stuff. But maybe they love some extra things that aren't pious. All of these would be God-loved things in virtue of their being loved by gods. All it takes is God's loving them to make them God-loved. But what makes these things pious? Why do gods love these things? What is special about this group? That's still an open question, even if pious things are all God-loved. That doesn't explain why the gods love them or what makes them pious. So there is separation between this concept of being God-loved and this concept of being pious. They are not the same thing. So what is the relationship then? That's still an open question. Now again, just to reiterate, Euthyphro could have avoided ending up here with this no-go solution by objecting when, I guess I erased my definition here, by objecting to this move. He didn't have to agree that the pious is loved by the gods for its piety, for a reason, because it is worthy of love, it's fit to be done, or something like that. If he instead had said, no, the gods just have whims, and we should do whatever their whims are so they don't burn down our cities. If that's the right answer, that avoids the problem we're in as far as giving Socrates the kind of definition that he wants. And also the question that might have been screaming at you from the beginning, how do you even know what the gods want? Are these really what are the gods? Are there really gods? Do they really want these things? Where does this stuff even come from? Why do people think we need to build temples? And where does this stuff come from? If these questions are screaming at you as the loopholes in this argument, those things might be worth pursuing. If you are not concerned about those questions, if you think, I do know there's a God, I know exactly what God wants, then it's harder to spell out this relationship. Oh, and I think God's commands aren't totally arbitrary. If you're committed to those things, it's really difficult to spell out what exactly is the relationship between the things that you ought to do insofar as the gods love them or have commanded them or whatever, and the nature, they're having been loved or commanded. Basically, in short, this relationship is hard to spell out on the assumption that there's a God. We know what they want or he wants. And it's not arbitrary. If you think those three things, it looks like you're left with this problem. So naturally, then, if you want to get out of this problem, it's either start over completely, we're not even on the right track at all, or start examining the assumptions that led us to this problem. Dear reader, dear Euthyphro, once you figure out why you get into this problem, let's examine our assumptions. That might be one of the things we're supposed to do as a reader. Now, those are all interesting possibilities and potential objections that one might raise to Euthyphro's definition, given where the conversation goes. But as far as the writing portion goes, as a general rule of thumb, summary before analysis and evaluation. So the part to summarize is accept the assumptions as they go along, try to explain what is Euthyphro's proposed definition, how does the question, the Euthyphro question, how does that question arise, why is it a problem for Euthyphro's definition, try to just stick to the text as closely as possible to summarize what's the proposal, what's the question, what's the problem, before you go into analysis and start analyzing beyond what actually happens in the text. So set up the argument in the text, and then you can provide analysis. What should Euthyphro have said? Where does Euthyphro's argument go wrong? Is Socrates' argument problematic? Are we supposed to, as readers, be questioning the assumptions that led us into that? What do you think about those assumptions? Which one should we reject, if any? So before you can start answering those kinds of questions, do the careful summary and don't mix it all together at once. Get the summary on the table so that you have that as a reference point for your analysis and evaluation. Okay, let's super briefly talk about the piety and justice part of the argument. And let's just sort of speak of justice really generally here as something like doing the right thing. So piety is somehow connected to justice. When he says that prosecuting his father is pious, in some sense it's doing the right thing specifically in a way that God would approve of, or it's part of doing the right thing insofar as God's care about the things that you do and why you do them. So piety has something to do with justice or doing the right thing. Right? Socrates kind of leads him down this path, but he did start by proposing justice in connection with his actions at the outset. So Socrates brings us back to the beginning of the dialogue and something at the heart of what Euthyphro's initial answer. We kind of got led down a path that was really interesting, but let's go back to the beginning. Euthyphro was interested in the justice of his actions, and maybe piety has something to do with justice. There's this distinction, is piety like part of justice? There's this category, doing the right thing, and piety is like a category as like a species of doing the right thing? Or is piety the bigger category, and doing the right thing is one of many pious things? And Euthyphro agrees, piety is part of justice. Which part? It's the part concerned with the care of the gods, and the rest is concerned with the care of men. So here is really his third definition. Here it is in a picture, okay? So justice, we said, is the bigger category. Piety is part of justice, so I drew it as a part. Here are some things in the list, piety. And maybe here are some other things that are not specifically pious, but are also part of justice. Some, honesty, truthfulness, fairness, not harming people, kindness. All of these things, in whether it's the piety category or all the rest, are something like doing the right thing. What is doing the right thing? And Euthyphro has agreed that some of the things we have to do the right thing have to do with care of the gods, and the rest have to do with care of men. What is Socrates' concern here? It's, what do you mean by care? Now you might be thinking like, oh, what's the difference between these things have to do with God and these things have to do with relationships between men? Why is that? It seems like they all kind of maybe, if that's where you're going, that's where the dialogue ultimately goes, right? But first question is just, what do you mean by care? And he leads Euthyphro through a couple of different conceptions of what we might mean by care or service to the gods, because we often think of the religious virtues or piety as the things we do to serve God in some sense, right? And so we're led through a series of ways of thinking about this care relationship between human beings and the gods, insofar as human beings serve the gods or insofar as they're being pious, and what exactly is the nature of this relationship. When you practice the religious virtues, when you are pious, when you engage in hospitality, worship, service, prayer, how exactly does that connect with the gods in some way? Does it provide care for them? How does that serve them? What do you mean? Right? So this is a really interesting question that doesn't really go, that we don't get a good answer to. So here's interesting open question that is probably still pressing if you think of yourself as serving a god, right? And then we sort of end with the big question, which is, why are these the things, like what holds this category together? We still don't have an answer to that question. What makes these things, whatever we mean by care or service, we still don't really have a good understanding of what you mean by this, Euthyphro. But even so, what makes these things pious? And he just gives his second answer again, which we've already seen doesn't work, and so then he runs off and the dialogue kind of just ends. But we're still left with an interesting question. So if you were summarizing this, you would try to do your best to set up his claim about piety being part of justice and try to set up, how do we get this question? The big question here is, what do you mean by care, Euthyphro? What do you mean by service to the gods? What is the relationship here? Trying to explain where this question comes from, what the problem is, and what this means for his answer. What's the so what here is what you would summarize. And then when it comes to analysis or evaluation, you can evaluate, how did the conversation go? Are there points where Euthyphro shouldn't have agreed to something? Or are there points where a definition could have worked? Or are they heading in the wrong direction entirely when they're thinking about the sense in which we care for or serve God insofar as we practice religious virtue, something like that? So can you answer some of these big questions and analyze how they attempted to answer the questions themselves in the dialogue? The final topic you had to choose from had to do with progress. And so in many ways, the responses to this question tended to be stronger. The writing responses that dealt with this question tended to be stronger, but in part that's just because summarizing the Euthyphro problem was really difficult. It was difficult to do the summary and the analysis. That was probably the harder topic to write about, and most people wrote about that one, which I think is awesome. And the progress one, in some ways, is easier to separate what you should summarize. It's kind of clear what you should, in some sense, what you should summarize, and how to go about evaluating it. And the number one place where people could have gone further in analyzing the progress was to go deeper in connecting with the text. So most people went through we had we know what the big question is. The big question is, what is piety? We've got that on the table. There's a series of answers. Each one gets shot down. What have we accomplished here? And the finding out what we don't know and being pushed to examine our assumptions is what most people focused on as the evaluation. We didn't get an answer, but did we get something out of this process? Or who got something out of the process? Euthyphro, Socrates, or the reader? And most people sort of focused on big picture stuff, like how you could have done something worthwhile without getting an answer. And most of the reasoning here was really interesting. And if you were to go further, it would be in really engaging with the text to learn something especially interesting or deep about the sense in which we make progress, engaging in the kind of conversation that we, the reader or Euthyphro, engages in when they read this dialogue. So, for an example, take claim 3. Piety is the part of justice concerned with the care of the gods. Now, we don't get an answer to what do we mean by the care of gods and how exactly is piety related to justice and what separates the pious things from the other aspects of justice. We don't get answers to those questions, but how exactly do we learn something? Yeah, you could go away, not deal with the text specifically and just generally think about, what value is there in learning things that aren't answers to questions? Is it good to know what you don't know and blah, blah, blah? Or we could try to engage with this particular conversation and the kinds of moves that Socrates made. What is he doing in this conversation with Euthyphro? What is Euthyphro doing in the conversation with Socrates? And what is the product? Now, to think about, I have something in mind here, and so maybe this is hard to follow, but imagine how, if you think there is progress here and that this dialogue is awesome, try to imagine how somebody would think, like, this was a completely worthless waste of time. What might they be seeing when they read this dialogue? Not just we didn't get an answer, but what happened to this dialogue that might rub them the wrong way or make them think this was all a waste of my time? Well, they might think that Socrates, like the citizens of Athens in the trial of Socrates, think he's just engaging in sophistry. How might what he's doing look like sophistry? Oftentimes, students interpret, and just in general, but I'm most familiar with, how my students are interpreting this text, will interpret Socrates as putting words in Euthyphro's mouth so he can shoot them down and go, aha, see, that's not it. He leads Euthyphro into these claims. Let's go back to piety being part of justice. Is it part of justice or the other way around? That one seems like kind of clear enough that when Euthyphro goes along with it, maybe it's because that seems good. And then Euthyphro provides his own. It's the part that has to do with the care of the gods. The rest has to do about relationships between men, but piety, religious virtue, has something to do with the relationship between human beings and gods. It has to do with the care of the gods. And Socrates wants to know what he means by that, and he does, in a sense, I don't like the term puts words in Euthyphro's mouth exactly, but he does help Euthyphro come up with ideas for what this means, but in part it's because when he asks Euthyphro doesn't have a very good answer ready to go. So what? That's an interesting question. So what? He doesn't have a good answer ready to go. Does that mean anything? But he doesn't have a good answer ready to go, and Socrates is trying to help him think deeply, you might think, about what this is, as an alternative to he's just trying to set Euthyphro up for failure to shoot him down. So if you think he's trying to help Euthyphro think deeply, how is he doing that? How does proposing an answer that to the reader and presumably to Euthyphro, so Socrates knows Euthyphro, he's a person who cares a lot about piousness, and he's sort of like a priest kind of guy. He proposes a definition that seems, to my eyes, obviously wrong, right? So what do you mean care of gods? Do you think we care for the gods in the same way, like by analogy, we care for little kids, or the master horseman takes care of horses, that we help to make them better and improve them? And of course that's the wrong answer. So why does Socrates give him an answer that's clearly wrong? Is there an interesting answer to that question? Is it because he's being shitty and wants to go, aha, and prove him wrong? Or is he leading him somewhere? And if so, is this helpful? What is he doing here? How does proposing a clearly wrong answer help Euthyphro to see that there is a deeper question here that admits of more than one answer. Like Euthyphro might have something half-baked or inchoate sort of in mind. It might be a really good answer, but he isn't really able to bring it into words, and just doesn't see any of the obvious wrong possibilities. So maybe pointing out something that's clearly not right can help you to start think about different relationships and expand the question and think about it more deeply, like what is actually happening here. So if you're going to really deeply engage with the text to think about the nature of progress, it helps to look at like, what exactly is Socrates doing? How is he doing it? Is it working? Now, also a lot of people see Euthyphro as getting kind of annoyed and not really trying too hard. Is he being lazy, and is that why he doesn't learn anything? Does he learn anything? Or is Socrates not bringing out his answers well enough? Like if Socrates was better at questioning or had a better attitude or something like that, would Euthyphro be a more willing participant, ready to dig in and clarify his ideas and support them? The Socratic irony when Socrates is saying, "Oh, you're so wise, teach me," you might be thinking that he's being a jerk, and that's not a way to like, "Oh, you're so wise." That's not going to get people to talk. But actually, it seems like it did get Euthyphro to talk, right? Instead of saying like, "Look, I'm going to school you, Euthyphro. I know that you don't know what you're talking about, and I'm going to lead you through a series of questions that you're not going to be able to answer, and when I push you, you won't be able to explain what you mean, and I will show that you don't know what you're talking about at all." That's not his attitude. His attitude is like, "Oh, you know something. Interesting. Well, enlighten me," right? And if we can tell that this is irony, Euthyphro, this is an interpretive claim that I'd have to back up with references to specific pieces of text, but Euthyphro doesn't seem to pick up on it. He goes on, well, like, yes, of course, I know, right? And then he seems to peter out at the end once he realizes that he actually has to show it in a clear way. But point here is just deeply engaging with what happened in the text to support your claims about how Euthyphro and Socrates are both engaging with the text, what exactly they're doing, what's working, where are they getting, what are they not getting, and or what the reader is doing, right? What readers are going to get something out of this text? What do you have to do as a reader? Just running your eyes over the words isn't likely to be very enlightening. So what do you have to do as a reader to get something out of this? And what exactly do you get out of it? So sort of trying to think through that in depth is the goal of analyzing this text to understand the sense in which we might learn something from it. Okay, this video ended up being much longer than I anticipated, and I apologize, but I sure hope it is helpful.